This is WVBN from around the world. At the League of Nations, purposes uncrossed. For the first time in years, the League itself began to seem relevant. Although within the palace the speeches and meetings continued unabated and without result, the salons were full in the evenings, and the business of international cooperation began to get done. Unknown parties contacted newspapers and radio news services around the world, arguing that now was the time for warring nations to set aside their differences for the sake of humanity's survival. They flattered all the great navies in every medium, calling them civilized worlds' first and last line of defense, and at least some people paid attention. In Italy, securing the imperial core. After the triumphs of the first week of the war, the battle-hardened Regia Marina turned its attention back to Italy and the Mediterranean, where they attempted to clear the Mediterranean as they had cleared the Red Sea. Although much work remains to be done, the Mediterranean is far safer than it was from Morgana predations. Fortifications along Italian coastlines were strengthened, and as the Mussolini regime publicized the Navy's successes, the essential strength of the government was strengthened as well. Perhaps a hint of overconfidence was beginning to show, or perhaps it was just well-earned pride. That said, there was one unexpected consequence to the Regia Marina's triumphant return to the central Mediterranean. Wounded and furious Morganas came crashing in waves against the Dardanelles, looking for easier prey in the Black Sea. A mighty maelstrom traveled with them as they forced the strait, causing a heavy toll of destruction. The Turks were not well pleased, and now a dangerous enemy has been reinforced in the Black Sea. In France, an Atlantic offense. The Marine Nationale built upon the defenses of Bordeaux the week before and struck out into the Bay of Biscay in the northeastern Atlantic Ocean, carrying the glory of the Republic with them. This gave their allies, the British, vital breathing room, and the French found themselves ranked as perhaps the most experienced fighters in the Atlantic. In Europe, though, clouds still gathered. The Italians were quick to declare that the ships protecting the French in the Mediterranean belonged to the Regia Marina, and though it wasn't entirely true, it struck some as true enough. As for the Polish War, the drôle de guerre has already begun, with the brief attempt on the Saar petering out without any territorial gains. Is it possible that the French, with all their advantages in men and material, will not prosecute the war? And what consequences might that have to an opportunistic foe? In the United Kingdom, Canada renders aid. The United Kingdom took advantage of the successes enjoyed by the French, the Americans, the Italians, and even the Germans. As the major approaches to the home islands were protected, Britain seized the opportunity to increase and protect transatlantic commerce with Canada. Welcome supplies flowed in, with record response from private citizens. Privately, early assurances were requested from Canadian leadership that the Royal Navy prioritized the defense of Canada. Their continued emphasis on the security of the British Isles cost them overseas, however. In Norway, it was painfully obvious that the defense of the North Sea and their own coasts had largely fallen to the Kriegsmarine. In India, the discussion in the provincial legislatures is beginning to mirror that of the National Congress, as it becomes clear that the British strength is not being expanded to protect the Indian subjects. What is more important, the war or independence? Is it possible that the United Kingdom could win this war without the resources, manpower, and money that has so long been the gift of India? In Japan, cooperative framework. The empire preferred an unlikely deal with the Soviet Union, sponsored principally by the IJN. The proposal was to coordinate actions, open bases, and pool resources in order to defeat the waves of Morgana flowing in from the north. The Soviets agreed in principle, but the negotiations soon encountered delay after delay, some of which seemed in hindsight unnecessary. In practical terms, this meant the Japanese were protecting the Soviet Pacific coastline at considerable expense without concrete aid or gains. While a brave face was put on it, the fact remains that the Soviets showed themselves to be poor partners when it mattered the most. This appeal to an international diplomatic framework was received warmly in Geneva. The comparative safety of the Japanese home islands, along with a string of victories in the north, was exploited for morale gains. However, the triumphs in the north came at a cost to the wider war effort against the Chinese. The Morgana freely raided and disrupted convoys, worsening both the general trade situation and the direct supply lines to China. The growing bitterness between the Army and Navy has attracted the particular interest of the Morgana sedition, though the nature of her interest was not immediately clear. What is known, however, is that she spared a number of fishermen, and at least one of them has evidently brought a letter to Maizuru. In the United States, Pacific mobilization. The U.S. Navy turns its attention to the West Coast, where Morgana attacks had become particularly fierce and where widespread panic had necessitated the imposition of martial law in California and Washington. Funding was allocated and coastal defenses were reinforced all along the Pacific. And it must be said that all the country's armed forces coordinated effectively and without obvious rivalries in protecting the coast. Moreover, in the midst of all the battle, American overland trade actually expanded, with new agreements made with Canada and Mexico and a renewal of interest in the Pan American Railroad. But for all that, the American public was beginning to worry that the Navy was too busy trying to catch up to the enemy to match the kinds of victories made by the French and Italians in the past week. After years of prioritized investment, a slight impatience was beginning to grow. According to the Bureau of Ordnance, American captains continued to display a lack of fighting spirit and intelligent use of the weapons provided for them. They recommended that new captains with the appropriate appetite for combat be promoted, because absolutely nothing could be wrong with their torpedoes. Meanwhile, the general neglect of the Caribbean, by Americans, British, and French alike, was beginning to breed a whole new set of concerns, with rumors and reports of Morgana incursions on land in the Antilles. Certainly, it's true that some small communities have seemingly disappeared without a trace. In Germany, assisting the Royal Navy. The German Kriegsmarine found themselves the apparent defenders of the North Sea, despite the Polish War and the presence of the British home fleet not very far away. Although inter-service cooperation had no framework, the British and German navies coordinated as well as could be against the major Morgana fleet, with German protection of trade established northward along the coast of Norway. In return, the Royal Navy seemed to tacitly agree that obstructing German Scandinavian trade was a much lower priority than bloodying the invaders' noses. For all that, there were downsides to this priority. The Kriegsmarine rank and file were beginning to expect that their fight would not be against their fellow human beings, an attitude that made sense overall, wartime radio and operational disciplines less than it might have otherwise been. There's no doubt that the Royal Navy observers gleaned important intelligence on the German Navy. The Soviets enjoyed the freedom of the Baltic as they began a series of naval exercises off the coast of Poland with unknown intentions. The invasion of Poland was delayed by the appearance of unknown riverine craft on the Vistula and the Warta, which slowed or made more hazardous the advance. Nonetheless, it has bought time only for the Polish defenders, who still see no rescue coming from France. From the Soviet Union, anti-Japanese rearmament. The Council of People's Commissars was willing to partner with Japan on regional security, but Japanese arrogance and triumphalism soured the relationship almost immediately. Japan became a shield against the Morgana, an effective one, and Moscow directed weapons and material to the Far East for a response to both Morgana and Japanese aggression. An influx of damaged and exhausted Morganas in the Black Sea meant combat experience with low losses, something the Black Sea Fleet took advantage of as often as it could. The Soviet Far East would be fortified, and it would not be friendly to Tokyo. As resources flowed eastward, Germany took note. The Soviets had commitments, and it remained to be seen if they would be equal of them. Meanwhile, Morganas probed Soviet defenses in the Arctic Circle, little deterred by the ice the winter would bring. Finally, Mistrust, the Morgana destroyer, appeared at the mouth of the Vistula, bringing with her a fresh rivercraft full from her own superstructure. What her intentions are remain unknown. This has been WVBN from around the world.